U.S. history shouldn't feel like a luxury purchase, a guessing game, or a lecture you were never really given. If books are out of budget, you don't know where to start, or your class skipped the good parts, this channel is for you. Here, we take the stories that shaped the United States and make them clear, sourced, and human. We zoom in on people usually left out, set events in context, and show how power works without gatekeeping or jargon. No paywalls, no sponsorships, no monetization. This is a nonprofit space built for learners, not ads. Every episode cites its sources and points you to ways to keep reading. From First Contact to Reconstruction, labor strikes to landmark court cases, grassroots movements to presidential decisions, we'll trace what happened, why it mattered, and who paid the price or pushed for change. If you've ever felt behind, you're not. Start anywhere. Ask questions. Disagree respectfully. Learning is the point. Subscribe, comment with what you want covered next, and share this with someone who deserves a better history class. Yes, I am very well aware that we already covered the American Revolution. But there's still so much to go into. Realistically, I could dedicate an entire channel to this subject. That said, this week has been grueling on me personally, and I didn't have time to write the typical in-depth essay for you all. However, I have taken this moment of exhaustion and turned it into that of opportunity. At the end of this brief essay and summary, I have some notes that you can all look into in your spare time, allowing yourself to do your own research on the topic. If this isn't something to your own liking, don't worry. This is not a permanent change to the channel. It's just something different and engaging that allows those who want to do their own digging to do so, while I also feel a little better about my subpar essay for today. Again, this essay isn't something I'm entirely confident about. Some of it is a rehash of my previous work, and other parts I'm debating on whether or not it's worth having its own dedicated video for, but that's up to you to decide. With that out of the way, here is the essay. The American Revolution was a complex social, political, and economic upheaval shaped by deep class tensions, the mobilization of common people for war, and the exclusion of Native Americans and the enslaved from its promises of liberty. In the 13 colonies of the 1770s, a relatively small, wealthy elite planters, merchants, and lawyers wielded political power, but they faced popular unrest among debtors, artisans, indentured servants, small farmers, and urban laborers. These groups protested taxes, debt foreclosures, and profiteering, and even after independence they continued to clamor for relief, as in Shays' Rebellion of 1786–87. Meanwhile, colonial governments and patriot leaders relied on white militias in the Continental Army, largely composed of yeoman farmers and artisans, to carry out the war. Women and enslaved Africans played vital supporting roles as camp followers, cooks, nurses, spies, and even soldiers, but they were largely denied political rights and often forgotten in revolutionary narratives. Native tribes were caught in the struggle. Many tried to stay neutral, but others took sides, and in the end, most indigenous peoples lost land and influence when the new United States expanded westward. Even as patriots proclaimed universal principles of liberty, the new political structures they created reflected sharp divisions. Class-based fears of majority rule and property redistribution made the framers design a strong republic with checks and balances and limited democracy. In short, the revolution must be understood not just as a fight against British tyranny, but as a domestic conflict over class, race, and power, a contest that shaped the Constitution and early republic. Which, by the way, William Penn's treaty with the Indians, engraving by Lambert Wideman 1869 allegorically, represents the fraught relationship between colonists and native peoples. Native Americans negotiated land and peace through diplomacy, as Penn did in 1683, but by the Revolution, these agreements had largely broken down. Most tribes found themselves with little say in the new nation's formation, despite having played active roles in the war. On the eve of the Revolution, colonial society was economically and socially stratified. A small upper crust of wealthy merchants, large planters, and professionals controlled most political offices. Middle-class craftsmen and smallholders aspired to climb the ladder, while indentured servants, impoverished veterans, urban laborers, and frontier farmers struggled with debt and low wages. As historian William Hogeland emphasizes, Class conflict was not peripheral but central to the founding era. He argues that class conflict is not just one of a number of interesting conflicts, but a main driver of forming the nation. Indeed, many ordinary colonists saw the revolutionary cause through an economic lens. They wanted relief from tax burdens, price gouging, and debt, while the leaders hoped independence would open new lands and markets and protect their investments. Labor and popular unrest flared repeatedly. For example, wartime shortages and profiteering spurred riots over bread and prices in 1777–78, and farmers in the Chesapeake region raided the estates of debtors and loyalists late in the war. After independence, frustrations culminated in armed uprisings. In 1786–87, indebted veterans and farmers led Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts to demand currency relief and the suspension of foreclosures. Although conservative Federalists, like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, portrayed such disturbances as dangerous mob violence, they reflected genuine grievances. Historians note that the framers drafted the Constitution partly in response to these uprisings. They feared a too democratic backlash. As William Hoagland points out, the Constitution was deliberately anti-democratic in order to be a pro-capitalist document. In Congress and state assemblies, debates also revolved around economics. Federalist leaders insisted on repaying creditors and supporting commerce, while debtors and smallholders urged protection from foreign competition and more democracy. James Madison encapsulated the issue in Federalist No. 10. The Constitution must control factions arising from the various and unequal distribution of property. In other words, lawmakers recognized that Americans were divided by class and economic interest. Landowners, merchants, artisans, and debtors all had conflicting stakes. The new Republican governments acknowledged popular demands. For example, many state constitutions expanded white male suffrage in annual elections, but they also built in safeguards. Governors and upper houses were retained, though weakened, to check the more radical impulses of the elected lower houses. This balance of interests was tested throughout the 1770s and 1780s. As one Rhode Island essayist sarcastically noted in 1784, Americans wanted liberty, but soon enough turned to oppress one another when it served their economic interests, implicitly echoing Dr. Samuel Johnson's quip about slavery. In short, the revolution unleashed egalitarian talk, but the social order remained contentious. The revolution mobilized an armed white population on an unprecedented scale. Colonial militia units, composed of local farmers, tradesmen, and neighbors, had a long tradition of colonial defense. During the war, they were the first responders to British threats. At Lexington and Concord, April 1775, Minutemen from surrounding towns swarmed in to confront the Redcoats, sparking the war. Yet these part-time soldiers were untrained and often reluctant to serve far from home. To field a more effective army, the Continental Congress created the Continental Army in 1775 under George Washington. This force depended heavily on continuous recruitment from the same population that made up the militias. Many new enlistees were young, single men from rural areas. Others were urban workers lured by enlistment bounties or the promise of pay, though payment was notoriously delayed. Desertion and short-term enlistments were perennial problems. By the end of 1775, less than half of the 20,000 men authorized had actually joined the new army, forcing Washington to call out the militias as reinforcements. Even among veterans, enlistments routinely expired after 1 or 2 years, creating constant manpower turnover. Supplies and discipline in the Continental Army were also persistent headaches. From the Siege of Boston in 1775 onward, soldiers faced dire shortages. Historian Frank Grizzard notes that critical shortages of arms and ammunition, clothing, shelter, and camp equipment persisted despite appeals to civilian authorities. Washington's letters from this period read like laundry lists of needs. In July 1775, he demanded returns of provisions, ordnance stores, powder, tools, tents, camp kettles, etc., and ordered that each man was given at least one blanket. During that first winter, thousands of raw recruits sat shivering in hastily built huts at Cambridge, and Washington warned Congress that without fuel and blankets he risked losing men simply to cold. Similar crises reoccurred at Valley Forge, 1777–78, and elsewhere. The Army's supply system was ad hoc. Congress had no established logistics department. Money was scarce. The treasury was totally exhausted by September 1775, and local governments often hoarded supplies or demanded exorbitant prices. Even after the appointment of competent staff like Quartermaster General Nathaniel Greene, shortages continued until late in the war. Discipline and morale in the ranks were closely related to these hardships. As summer 1775 turned to autumn, enlistment terms ran out and many soldiers clamored to go home or re-enlist only conditionally. Washington lamented that, by January 1776, he was weaker than I had any idea of and complained of a confused and distorted state of his forces. Instances of breakdowns occurred. Guards from different units would fight over scarce food, and officers constantly struggled to prevent theft and desertion. However, harsh punishments, up to execution, and the threat of general service eventually held the army together. The militias themselves were limited in function. Each colony's militia was legally obliged to serve only near home and resisted long deployments. Thus, during major campaigns, the Continental Army fought primarily in the field, while local militias provided support, garrisoned forts, or guarded the coasts. As a result, the American war effort was largely a people's war of citizen soldiers enduring supply shortages and harsh conditions. The sacrifice of these rank-and-file men, most of them small farmers and artisans, made independence possible, even as the officers, many of them drawn from the gentry, made strategic decisions. Native American tribes had a long-standing and fraught history with British colonists well before 1775. Decades of encroachment on Indian lands, cultural conflict, and disease had devastated many tribes. Some neighboring peoples tried to maintain neutrality as the British and colonists went to war, but neutrality itself became a fraught choice. Colonial wars in the 1750s to 60s, French and Indian War, and 1770s had taught all parties that native warriors were powerful allies or enemies on the frontier. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, issued after the French War, had reserved lands west of the Appalachians to Native Americans and angered land-hungry settlers. Thus, by 1776, many native leaders assumed British victory would better protect their homelands. Britain had at least formally promised to restrain settlement. As Isaac Makos notes, British were concerned by violence between white settlers and native peoples on the frontiers and tried with limited success to separate them, while the colonists resented such restrictions. Once war broke out, both sides courted Indian support. The Iroquois Confederacy Six Nations itself became split. The Oneida and Tuscarora sided with the Americans, believing mutual benefit with settlers. The Mohawk, Seneca, Onondaga, and Cayuga largely sided with the British, especially under leaders like Joseph Brant, Mohawk, who remembered British promises of land protection. South and west of the Iroquois, other tribes likewise weighed their options. The Cherokee in the Carolinas largely feared colonial expansion and sided with Britain, though even they were divided internally. In the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes region, many tribes Shawnee, Delaware, Wyandot, Ojibwa, and others joined the British war effort, raiding frontier settlements. British agents operating from frontier forts, Niagara, Detroit, Vincennes, etc., actively recruited native war parties to strike at Patriot territories, hoping to tie down American forces. In response, Washington ordered General John Sullivan's 1779 expedition, which burned native villages and crops in Iroquois country to break the frontier raids. The aftermath earned Washington the terrifying epithet town destroyer among the Six Nations, reflecting the brutal nature of frontier warfare. Despite these contributions, Native Americans had almost no voice in the Revolution's outcome. In the 1783 Treaty of Paris that ended the war, the British ceded to the United States all land east of the Mississippi and south of Canada with no native consent, even though most tribes had allied with Britain precisely to defend those lands. Once the settlers poured in, they justified expropriation by branding all indigenous peoples as British allies. Many tribes, regardless of earlier neutrality or alliances, faced displacement. Some frontier tribes resisted even after 1783, for example, the Northwestern Confederacy, Shawnee, Miamis, etc., fought a war against U.S. expansion in the 1790s. But key native strongholds and political independence were shattered. As Makos observes, the Revolution cost Native Americans much, much more than it cost Britain. The new American government ignored Indian claims and expanded relentlessly. Meanwhile, a small number of native individuals did fight for the patriot cause. The Stockbridge Mohicans in Massachusetts sent men to the siege of Boston, Delaware, and Wappinger warriors assisted Washington in New York in 1776. There were even one or two unique all-native units, like a company of Wappinger sharpshooters under John Brand of the Stockbridge tribe, but by and large most tribes felt Americans were a greater immediate threat to their lands. In sum, the Revolution unfolded partly in Indian country, and its politics and outcomes reshaped the continent. As one scholar points out, indigenous peoples were not passive observers, but their perspective and grievances, historical ties, land autonomy, often fell outside the final political settlement. Slavery and race added another dimension to the Revolution's contradictions. Colonists loudly invoked liberty and natural rights, yet in 1776 about 20% of the colonial population in the United States was enslaved. African American reactions were pragmatic and varied. Many slaves resisted or escaped, but most could not directly influence politics. However, both sides in the conflict sought to use blacks as a pawn. Early on, the Continental Congress actually barred African Americans from military service except in a few coastal militia units like Glover's Marblehead Mariners. Southern legislators worried arming slaves might incite uprisings. In contrast, the British exploited these fears. In 1775, Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, issued a famous proclamation promising freedom to any enslaved person who joined the Crown's forces. Throughout the war, British commanders issued similar offers. Sir Henry Clinton's Philipsburg Proclamation of 1779 promised liberty to any slaves who fled rebel masters. These British promises were strategic. As Zielinski notes, the goal was to disrupt the continental unity at any cost by drawing Southern colonists into fear of slave rebellion. In practice, hundreds of slaves took the risk and escaped into British lines. By war's end, an estimated 100,000 enslaved people had fled to the British, nearly a quarter of all Southern slaves. The British formed ad hoc corps of black soldiers, the Ethiopian Regiment, the Black Company of Pioneers for labor and limited combat roles, though smallpox and desertion decimated these units. In one notorious engagement, 1780 Charleston, the sight of formerly enslaved men fighting alongside British troops terrified many planters. On the American side, seeing the momentum, Rhode Island and Connecticut reluctantly raised integrated units by 1778-81, while free blacks and some ex-slaves volunteered for patriot companies by Yorktown in 1781. Perhaps 1/5 of Washington's army was black. Notably, African Americans also fought as partisans behind lines. New Jersey's feared Colonel Ty, a runaway slave, led the Black Brigade in raids against rebels. Nevertheless, neither side intended genuine emancipation at the Revolution's end. Most American leaders, espousing Enlightenment rhetoric, still clung to racial hierarchies. Indeed, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, among others, hailed the war as ending British tyranny. But enslaved people realized the paradox. As Dr. Samuel Johnson remarked in 1775, one hears the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes. After the war, northern states began gradual emancipation, but in the South, slavery expanded, with cotton and tobacco booming. Ex-slaves who had fought or been promised freedom by the British generally emigrated to Canada, the Caribbean, or Sierra Leone. Meanwhile, free blacks who remained faced new discrimination. Some states enacted restrictive black codes, and the Constitution itself enshrined slavery by counting 3/5 of a state's slaves for representation, and forbidding Congress from banning the slave trade until 1808. In short, African Americans were largely spectators to the Revolution, whose ideals buoyed later abolitionist arguments but did not immediately grant them equality. Also, American soldiers at the Siege of Yorktown, 1781, by Jean-Baptiste Antoine de Verger. The figure on the far left is an African American infantryman of the One Stone Rhode Island Regiment. By the war's end, nearly 20% of Continental troops at Yorktown were black, reflecting how wartime exigencies temporarily opened the ranks. Behind them, like cannons and French allies, the tricolor flying suggests the decisive Franco-American victory. Such images remind us that the Revolution mobilized a diverse, if unevenly recognized, fighting force. Women on both sides of the conflict helped sustain the war and the homes left behind. even as social norms confined them largely to the domestic sphere. Many followed armies as camp followers, doing the indispensable but arduous work of cooking, laundry, sewing uniforms, and nursing wounded soldiers. Washington's own household managers, his wife Martha, and Martha's enslaved attendant Ona Judge, moved with the army in winter encampments. Others maintained farms and shops back home, sometimes under great stress, with fathers and husbands away. Wives fended for children, sheltered refugees, or even confronted enemy foragers. In extreme cases, women saw battle up close. Famous anecdotes of Molly Pitcher Mary Ludwig Hayes describe her bringing water to thirsty gunners at Monmouth 1778, and then manning her husband's cannon when he fell. Margaret Corbin similarly took her place after Fort Washington's gun crews were all hit, earning a lifetime pension after losing an arm. Dozens of lesser-known women did such heroic duty, though military pensions and honors were rarely accorded to them. Some women crossed wartime gender lines in surprising ways. A few even disguised themselves as men to fight. Deborah Sampson of Massachusetts enlisted as Robert Shurtleff in 1782, serving in the field until a head wound exposed her sex. Others engaged in espionage. Women like Lydia Dara, Pennsylvania, and the Culper Rings Agent 355, New York, risked clandestine missions, using their perceived innocence to gather intelligence. And some wielded pen and voice. Mercy Otis Warren, mentioned earlier, corresponded with leaders and later wrote a history of the Revolution, while Phyllis Wheatley, an enslaved poet in Boston, published patriotic verses and personally read one to General Washington in 1776. Hundreds of ordinary mothers and daughters also organized boycotts of British goods or produced homespun cloth to undercut imports, the Daughters of Liberty being the most famous such group. Still, women's wartime roles did not translate into political equality. Revolutionary ideology did inspire some calls for greater rights. Abigail Adams famously urged her husband John, then in the Continental Congress, to remember the ladies when framing new laws, warning that women would otherwise foment a revolution of their own. Such protestations exemplified how women began to see themselves as stakeholders in the new order, but leaders, mostly men, generally stopped short of expanding suffrage or divorce rights for women. Legal coverture remained in force. Married women's legal identities were subsumed under their husbands, and most property and custody laws still favored men. Nonetheless, the revolution changed women's lives in subtler ways. War mobilization had politicized women's thinking. In the post-war Republican ideology, women were celebrated, at least in theory, as the guardians of virtue in the family. In the years after independence, many state constitutions even briefly allowed unmarried property-owning women to vote, notably in New Jersey until 1807. More broadly, historians like Linda Kerber argue that a new ideal of the Republican mother took hold. Women were urged to become educated citizens so they could raise virtuous sons for the Republic. The public began to value female education and moral influence. Yet Kerber also cautions that this role was circumscribed. It granted women a kind of informal political influence, the fourth branch of government, but still defined them chiefly as caretakers. In practice, immediate gains were limited. In many communities, women like Mercy Warren or young Sybil Ludington, who famously rode to alert militia at Danbury in 1777, were praised for bravery, but society remained patriarchal. The revolution did not usher in gender equality. Rather, it redefined gender roles within existing bounds. Women's wartime contributions were acknowledged in patriotic lore, but afterward, most women found their legal and political status largely unchanged. As historian Jan Lewis observes, the ideal of the patriotic wife and mother was strengthened, but harmony took precedence over equality. After victory, Americans faced the task of turning revolutionary ideals into government. Under the Articles of Confederation, ratified 1781, the national government was too weak to cope with debts, trade disputes, and internal unrest. By 1787, delegates convened in Philadelphia to frame a new constitution. The Constitutional Convention was dominated by wealthy planters, creditors, and merchants, men who feared the instability of pure democracy and debt relief demands. They famously set rules that their proceedings be secret and above popular review, allowing negotiations that later revealed a mix of compromises and self-interest. A key issue was how to balance democracy with protection of property. Many delegates worried about majoritarian abuses. As Madison argued in Federalist No. 10, factions driven by the unequal distribution of property threatened stability. The solution was a compound republic. Congress and the new presidency would be checked by the Senate and an independent judiciary, with both federal and state levels sharing power. Direct popular control was limited. The president would not be directly elected by the people, but by the Electoral College, senators chosen by state legislatures until 1913, and high offices in some states appointed by legislatures. Even the language of the preamble, "We the people," obscured the fact that large segments women, most blacks non-landholders, were not voting citizens. As Gordon Wood has shown, the 1787 Constitution embodied both Enlightenment liberal ideals and classical fears of mob rule. In later years, scholars would debate whether its framers were protecting an aristocracy of wealth or trying to create a robust nation-state. But from the start, the document was intended to be expansive of commerce and credit, even at the expense of direct democracy. Slavery was one of the gravest compromises. The convention never used the word slave or slavery, but it allowed slaveholders political concessions. The infamous 3/5 compromise counted 3/5 of each state slaves for House representation, boosting the South's influence. Congress was forbidden to ban the transatlantic slave trade before 1808, effectively allowing importation for 20 more years. Even then, the Constitution would give Congress authority to tax those imports as property. Northern delegates were uneasy with these measures, but most were also slaveholders or did not oppose slavery. Strongly, they chose to preserve Union over abolition. Notably, George Mason of Virginia wished to add language condemning slavery. Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania vented that slavery made a mockery of Republican ideals, yet they dropped these amendments under pressure. Ratification itself revealed further tensions. Anti-Federalists like Brutus and Patrick Henry railed that the new government threatened individual liberties and states' rights. Federalists, Madison, Jay, Hamilton, countered by a series of essays, the Federalist Papers explaining the checks and balances and warning of anarchy without a strong central government. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, was added in 1791 largely to satisfy anti-Federalist fears of unchecked power. Scholars note that even with ratification settled, the interpretation of the Constitution was hotly contested. As Jill Lepore observes, the document was made to be adaptable, its meaning debated by courts and politicians, and even Jefferson's strict versus Hamilton's loose construction debates, making it a living constitution from the start. Historians continue to analyze the Constitution from many angles. In the mid-20th century, Charles Beard famously argued that it was essentially an economic document protecting elite property interests, an interpretation now viewed as too simplistic. More recent work gives a fuller picture. Woody Holton, citing Todd Grosh and others, emphasizes how debts in commerce were major issues. The Constitution protected creditors by enabling a national debt and preventing states from debasing currency. Gordon Wood and Joseph Ellis point out that many framers saw themselves as creating a stable nation above partisan fights, a nation-building project. Anita M.C. Mahon and T.H. Breen highlight how delegates used revolutionary rhetoric of sacred rights, but also manipulated that language. Alan Taylor sees the Continental Congress and Constitution as successive attempts by politicians to manage the tumult of war and its economic aftermath. No less, Laurel Ulrich and Carol Birkin remind us that many voices during ratification were women, small farmers, and artisans, even if we mostly read the letters of men. Importantly, the ideological framing of the Constitution absorbed Revolutionary-era ideals but also departed from them. It proclaimed republicanism, a government deriving from the people, yet set up many indirect elections and protected property to assuage propertied men. The language of liberty was enshrined. Liberty appears 5 times in the final text, but often narrowed in scope. For example, the president's commander-in-chief role and the federal judiciary's power aimed at controlling popular majorities. The founders balanced rhetoric about inalienable rights with pragmatic compromises. They resolved that Congress shall make no law interfering with certain freedoms, First Amendment, but stopped short of declaring equal rights for all women's suffrage, where abolition of slavery were not included. In sum, the Constitution reconciled some of the revolution's class and regional conflicts. It was a new compact by elite negotiators, even as it left others unresolved and open for future generations to contest. The American Revolution fundamentally transformed the colonies, but its promises were unevenly realized. It rallied an armed populace of ordinary white colonists against British rule, driven by mixed motives of liberty and self-interest. It broke the empire's hold on government, yet left in place social hierarchies and excluded groups. Enslaved Africans and Native Americans bore the revolution's costs quietly, losing land or continuing bondage even as white patriots won self-rule. Women contributed heroically to the cause, but emerged still without a voice at the polls. The new state constitutions, and ultimately the federal constitution, reflected both revolutionary ideals of liberty and the conservative instincts of their framers. They constructed a republic with checks against excessive democracy, balancing popular power with protection of property and national unity. Thus, the revolution's contentions between equality and hierarchy, expansion and exclusion, democracy and property, were encoded into the nation's foundations. As modern historians show, there was nothing inevitable about this outcome. The conflict could have taken a more egalitarian turn, for example, with a more robust debt relief or abolition program, but it did not. Instead, the revolution produced a new nation in which the tensions of class, race, and gender would continue to shape politics for decades to come. A thorough understanding of 1775 to 1789 must therefore look beyond battles and independence to these deeper layers of conflict. Only then can we grasp how the birth of the United States was as much a domestic social revolution as it was a war of liberation. Deep dive addendum and context pack. One mobilizing an already armed populace who enlisted why they stayed, why they left. Colonial North America had extraordinarily high rates of firearm familiarity among white males due to hunting, pest control, militia musters, and frontier life. But willingness to fight was conditional. Bounties, cash, clothing, blankets, land promises, and local honor pulled men in. Late pay, thin rations, and family needs pushed them back out. Short enlistment terms, often 6 to 12 months early in the war, meant churn. Officers pleaded relentlessly with state assemblies to convert short-term militia zeal into multi-year Continental enlistments. Recruitment never flattened society as evenly as patriotic posters imply. Town meeting minutes and county records show that the respectable, rate-paying householders, master craftsmen, established farmers were favored in militia officer elections, while servants, strollers, vagrants, and the unsettled were initially excluded or funneled into the ranks. As the war lengthened and casualty lists grew, states authorized drafts and substitutes, effectively monetizing service. Wealthier men could pay someone else, frequently poorer, younger, or immigrant men, to go in their place. Bounty jumping, enlisting to collect a local or state bounty, deserting and re-enlisting elsewhere, became a chronic headache, a byproduct of fragmented state procurement and desperate men gaming a chaotic system. 2. The Continental Army's sinews, logistics, disease, drill, and discipline. Logistics, from Cambridge 1775 to Valley Forge 1777 to 78. And Morristown 1779 to 80. Supply was the war's constant villain. Congress lacked taxing power under the Articles and relied on requisitions to states, which relied on county committees, which relied on local compliance, each link an opportunity for delay or graft. When winter roads became impassable, wagons froze in place. When harvests failed or speculators withheld grain, prices spiked and soldiers starved. Officers learned to write a new American prose genre, the supply lamentation letter. Quartermasters scrambled for draft animals, forage, tents, and shoes. Soldiers marched with feet wrapped in rags, left bloody prints in snow, and bartered for shirts. Disease and inoculation. Smallpox threatened to annihilate the army more surely than British bayonets. Washington's 1777 decision to inoculate the Continental ranks, variolation at first, then vaccination later in the century, was an audacious public health gamble. It saved lives, stabilized regimental strength, and helped the Army survive the 1777-78 winter. Camp fevers, typhus, dysentery still ravaged encampments, latrine placement, water sources, and ration quality became literal matters of life and death. Drill and professionalization. Baron von Steuben's regulations for the order and discipline of the troops of the United States, the Blue Book, standardized formations, firing cycles, bayonet work, and camp order. He trained model companies that then trained others, creating a multiplier effect. The psychological shift from local militia mobs to a professionalized national force was as important as any tactical refinement. By Monmouth 1778, and certainly by Yorktown 1781, American units could stand toe-to-toe in line of battle with British regulars. Discipline, courts-martial punished theft, desertion, drunkenness on duty, and insubordination. Flogging remained legal and common. Chaplains and officers invoked Republican virtue but relied on very unrepublican lash counts to keep men in their place. Harshness ebbed and flowed with morale. Where pay and rations improved, lashings decreased. Where hunger grew, so did the whip. 3% war economy, inflation and just price, class friction in cities and market towns, inflation and scarcity. Continental currency slid toward not worth a continental as emissions outpaced confidence and British counterfeiting flooded markets. Prices for salt, flour, and cloth leapt unpredictably. Committees of safety and inspection, grassroots revolutionary bodies, policed forestallers, hoarders, and speculators, posted just prices and occasionally seized warehouses. These committees were schools of politics for middling whites, mechanics, shopkeepers, and flashpoints for class conflict with well-connected merchants. Philadelphia's 1779 turbulence, the Fort Wilson affair, distilled the moment. Radical militia and artisans, furious over high prices and elite obstruction of price controls, confronted James Wilson and other conservative leaders. A silk-stocking brigade defended them. The episode wasn't simply lawless mob versus order. It was an argument over who should pay the war's costs. Similar price control agitations appeared in Boston, Charleston, and smaller ports. Contracting and profiteering. Wartime contracts enriched a network of provisioners and outfitters. Meanwhile, the line soldiers' pay lagged and depreciated. This asymmetry fed mutinies and hardened the suspicion, voiced in taverns and petitions, that some fight, others feed, for mutiny and negotiation, the politics inside the ranks. Pennsylvania Line Mutiny, January 1781. Underfed, unpaid Continentals killed an officer during a confrontation and marched on Philadelphia with artillery. Washington privately urged conciliation first. Accept discharges for men whose enlistments had been misrecorded, pay arrears if possible, and avoid turning the army against itself. The crisis ended in negotiated discharges and furloughs, proof that food and justice could dissolve rebellion more effectively than muskets pointed at hungry men. New Jersey Line Mutiny, later January 1781. A smaller copycat revolt met a different fate. Washington, now fearing contagion, sent a loyal detachment that surrounded the mutineers, compelled surrender, and executed ringleaders by firing squads composed of their comrades. An example, he said, grim pedagogy to restore deterrence. Newburgh Conspiracy, 1783. As peace loomed, unpaid officers brooded over back pay and half-pay pensions. Anonymous circulars urged a more forceful stance. Washington's intervention, appealing to officers' honor and theatrically admitting his failing eyesight as he donned spectacles, diffused the moment. Congress commuted half-pay for life to a lump sum of 5 years' full pay, paid mostly in certificates, which speculators often bought at discounts. The episode etched a norm. The Army would obey civilian authority, but only if civilian authority honored the Army's sacrifices. 5 indigenous nations, diplomacy, fracture, and the treaty treadmill. Pre-war context. The proclamation line of 1763, Pontiac's War, and a patchwork of colonial land frauds set the stage. Iroquois diplomacy, the Covenant chain. Ohio Valley polyethnic villages and Southern confederacies had learned to play European rivals against one another. Independence erased that leverage. During the war, the Haudenosaunee fractured. Oneida and Tuscarora tended Patriot, Mohawk, Seneca, Onondaga, Cayuga, largely went with Britain. Sullivan's 1779 expedition burned at least 40 Iroquois towns, fields, orchards, and stored maize, producing famine the next winter. In the South, Cherokee and Creek war parties struck frontier settlements. Retaliatory raids devastated their towns. In the Old Northwest, Shawnee, Miami, and Delaware alliances, supported from Detroit, targeted Kentucky and western Pennsylvania forts. After the war, Treaty Cascade and encroachment, the United States made treaties at Fort Stanwix 1784 and Hopewell 1785-86, extracting massive cessions, often from partial councils that didn't represent all claimants. Settler violations provoked another cycle of war, culminating in defeats of U.S. expeditions: Harmar 1790, St. Clair 1791, before Wayne's victory at Fallen Timbers 1794, and the Treaty of Greenville 1795. The Northwest Ordinance 1787 promised utmost good faith toward Indians while simultaneously providing the legal chassis for orderly settlement. An emblem of the Republic's doublespeak, pledge benevolence, pursue dispossession. Function of the frontier. For coastal elites, Western settlement was a release valve: grant or sell tracts to veterans and migrants, create a buffer against indigenous resistance, and convert land into revenue and political loyalty. Frontier violence, in turn, yoked poor settlers to federal power, forts, militias, and federal troops as clients in a new internal empire. 6 Black Loyalists, Black Patriots, and the Limits of Emancipation. British side. Dunmore's Proclamation 1775 and Clinton's Phillipsburg Proclamation 1770 promised freedom to enslaved people who fled rebel masters. Thousands reached British lines. The war's end saw evacuation of many to Nova Scotia and London, documented in the Book of Negroes. Disillusion in Nova Scotia, broken land promises, racism, poverty, pushed hundreds to join the 1792 migration to Sierra Leone, founding Freetown. Their sermons, petitions, and newspapers formed one of the Atlantic world's earliest black public spheres. American side. Northern states admitted black soldiers in integrated units by necessity. Rhode Island's One Stone Regiment included formerly enslaved men promised manumission. Free black communities in port cities. Boston, Newport, Philadelphia organized mutual aid societies and churches in the 1780s to 90s. Petitioners cited revolutionary ideals to demand schooling, testimony rights, and franchise. Northern emancipation came piecemeal. Pennsylvania's 1780 Gradual Act, Massachusetts' de facto end via the Quackwalker decisions, 1783, New York 1799 Gradual, New Jersey 1804 Gradual, leaving many enslaved well into the 19th century. In the Chesapeake, manumissions rose briefly. In the Deep South, Cotton's ascent cemented slavery's expansion. Patrol state. White anxieties hardened into law. Patrols, passes, curfews, bans on assembly, and prohibitions on literacy. The revolution widened black aspiration and institutional capacity, churches, schools, while the constitutional settlement entrenched slavery's political leverage: 3/5 clause, slave trade clause, fugitive slave clause, 7 women's war work, and the invention of Republican motherhood. On campaign, camp followers, wives, widows, and single women were logistical backbones: cooking, laundering, mending, nursing, foraging, and hauling. Muster rolls occasionally list rations to women. Pension files preserve gritty detail: wounds dressed, shirt sewn, bread baked. Famous vignettes: Molly Pitcher at Monmouth, Margaret Corbin at Fort Washington, symbolize dozens of unnamed women who handled sponges and rammers amid grape shot. On the home front, female-led boycotts, for example, the 1774 Edenton Tea Party in North Carolina, spinning bees and provisioning committees knitted neighborhoods into a politics of consumption. Esther de Burt Reed and the Ladies' Association of Philadelphia raised funds and stitched garments for soldiers, arguing that women could be patriotic citizens through feminine civic virtue. In print and petition, Abigail Adams's Remember the Ladies letter demanded legal reform. Judith Sargent Murray's On the Equality of the Sexes, 1790, made a philosophic case for female intellect and education. Phyllis Wheatley's poetry wove together Christian universalism and Republican rhetoric to indict hypocrisy. None of this cracked coverture. Voting exclusions. Save New Jersey's brief window for propertied women, closed in 1807, or inheritance inequities. But by 1800, female academies multiplied, and the Republican mother ideal normalized female education as public purpose, an opening wedge for later suffrage arguments. 8 state constitutions, radical experiments, and retrenchment. Pennsylvania, 1,776. A unicameral legislature, annual elections, broad male suffrage, a weak plural executive, and a council of censors to audit government. This was the high-water mark of radical constitutionalism. The 1790 Pennsylvania Constitution reintroduced a Senate and tightened the reins, evidence of elite counter-mobilization. Other states, many lowered property thresholds for voting yet retained higher bars for office, installing a filter between the people and power. Religious establishments withered in some states but persisted via taxes elsewhere. Bills of rights proliferated, balancing ringing declarations with carve-outs, for example, treasonous speech exemptions. 9. The Federal Constitution, bargains, breaks, and built-in biases. Architecture, bicameral legislature, a powerful independent executive, life-tenure judiciary, federal supremacy over states, and a capacious commerce clause. Popular sovereignty filtered through indirect selection, electoral college, state legislature chosen senators until 1913, a design that manages democracy rather than embodies it. Compromises, Great Compromise, population-based House, state-based Senate. Slavery compromises, 3/5 for apportionment, slave trade protected until 1808, fugitive slave clause, nationalized rendition. Contracts and credit, bans on state laws impairing contracts and emitting paper money, reassured creditors and bondholders. Ratification debate. Anti-federalists, Brutus, Cato's Sentinel, warned of consolidated power, distant elites, standing armies, and judicial overreach. Federalists Madison, Hamilton, J. argued only a large republic could control faction and protect liberty. The Bill of Rights followed, as political necessity, an interpretive battleground. No law abridging met reality in 1798's Sedition Act, teaching the country how fragile absolute clauses can be under perceived emergency. 10. Hamilton's state building, public credit, the bank, and the whiskey frontier. Reports on public credit and manufactures, funding federal and state debts at par tied wealthy bondholders to the regime. Assumption created a national creditor class. A Bank of the United States 1791 yoked public finance to private capital. Proposed tariffs and bounties nudged the economy toward domestic manufactures. Jefferson and Madison objected strict construction, agrarian vision, birthing the first party system. Whiskey Rebellion 1794. The distilled spirits excise hit small Western producers hardest. Locals framed resistance in revolutionary idiom, liberty poles, petitions. But the federal government marched a massive militia force west and arrested leaders. It was a constitutional demonstration. Taxation with representation still meant taxation with enforcement. A republic with teeth had arrived. 11 land as policy, ordnance lines, surveys, and settler finance. Land Ordinance 1785 and Northwest Ordinance 1787. Rectangular surveys, townships, sections, this bureaucratic geometry monetized the continent. Land sales serviced debt, funded schools Section 16, and converted wilderness in federal parlance into mortgageable property. The same law that banned slavery in the Northwest pledged good faith toward Indians, settlers, and speculators treated the latter as rhetorical garnish. Confiscation and legitimation. Loyalist estates, once forfeited, were redistributed selectively. Some enriched connected patriots, others seeded a class of smallholders and veterans, creating buy-in for the new order. Tenants in New York and the mid-Hudson gained titles in some cases, then learned they had traded landlords for banks, 12 urban mechanics, artisans, and the politics of protection. Artisan societies in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston paraded for ratification and petitioned for tariffs to shield hats, nails, glass, and ships from British competition. Their embrace of federal power wasn't deference to elites, it was a calculated bet that a national government would privilege domestic production. This is the hinge of the new consensus. Some working people saw their prospects aligned with the nation-state. and so help stabilize elite rule. 13 primary source spotlights you can quote or paraphrase. Alexander Hamilton, Philadelphia, 1787 to 88. All communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The people are turbulent and changing. Give therefore to the first class a distinct, permanent share in the government. Captures elite fear of majorities. Pairs well with your Madison No. 10 material. Abigail Adams to John Adams, 1776. Remember the ladies. Signals gender demands at the creation. Benjamin Banneker to Thomas Jefferson, 1791. Challenges racist assumptions and appeals to universal equality. Soldier petitions and mutiny articles, 1781. Raw grievances about arrears, clothing, and enlistment frauds. Perfect for giving voice to the ranks. Oneida and Mohawk speeches, 1777 to 79. Illustrate indigenous divisions and their rationales. Black Loyalist certificates in the Book of Negroes, 1783. Names, ages, skills. Humanizing proof of black agency and British evacuation promises. 14 anchoring timeline. Quick reference for you. 1775 to 76. Mobilization, Cambridge Siege, Inoculation Debates Declaration. 1777. Saratoga, Valley Forge Winter begins. Franco-American alliance negotiated. 1778. Monmouth, French fleet arrives. Western-Southern War intensifies. Sullivan Expedition, 1779 next. 1779. Sullivan burns Iroquois towns. Inflation riots crest. 1780. Charleston, falls. Cornwallis campaigns through the Carolinas. Black and Loyalist raids surge. 1781. Cowpens, Guilford Courthouse, Pennsylvania and New Jersey mutinies. Yorktown, with Rochambeau and de Grasse. 1783. Treaty of Paris, Newburgh Conspiracy. 1785 to 87. Land and Northwest Ordinances, Shays' Rebellion, Constitutional Convention. 1788 to 91. Ratification, Bill of Rights, Hamilton's Program, Bank Chartered. 1794 to 95. Whiskey Rebellion, Fallen Timbers, Treaty of Greenville. 1798. Alien and Sedition Acts, Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions. 15 Historiography Map, How Scholars Frame the Contradictions. Social Conflict Emphasis, Howard Zinn, Stoughton Lind, William Hoagland. Revolution as Elite Project Discipline from Above, with real but limited concessions to middling whites. Republican Ideology, Bernard Bailyn, Gordon Wood. Ideas about virtue, corruption, and balanced constitutions drive institutional design. Fear of licentious democracy is theoretical, not merely self-interest. Borderlands and Indigenous. Frame, Alan Taylor, Pekka Hamalainen. Revolution as Continental Contest. Indian polities as central actors, not footnotes. Gender and Household Politics, Linda Kerber, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. Women's civic labor refashions domesticity into a political idiom, Republican motherhood, but legal equality lags. Black Atlantic, Sylvia Frey, Simon Schama. Enslaved people exploit wartime fishers. Black Loyalist diaspora, Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone, broadens the revolution's geography. Constitution and Capital, Charles Beard Classic. Woody Holton revisionist nuance. Credit, land, and trade imperatives fuse with state building to produce a durable, creditor-friendly federal frame. 16 pull quotes and micro-vignettes to enrich your narrative. A New England quartermaster noting no shoes to march, no flour to bake, no rum to warm the blood, a triad of morale. A Pennsylvania committee minute tallying seized barrels of flour just price, demonstrating bottom-up regulation. An Oneida messenger carrying maize to starving Continentals during the winter, complicating simple sides. A Black Loyalists entry, Bessie, 28, born in Virginia, formerly property of, proof of names and motion, not abstraction. A widow's pension testimony listing shirts sewn and wounds dressed, translating women's work into quantifiable service. A tenant farmer's pre-war rent receipt versus post-war mortgage note, same signature, different master.